Speaking of democracy, the government had a change to the law forced on it earlier this year before the election. In a highly unusual situation, the minority government couldn't stop laws passing both the Senate and the House of Representatives, laws that made it easier for refugees and asylum seekers to come to Australia from offshore processing on Nauru or Manus Island on the grounds of medical treatment, the Medivac laws. I said at the time that this was Bill Shorten's first big political mistake to back those laws, a sign of hubris in the lead up to the election. There were no cases, I repeat, no cases of refugees failing to get medical care that they needed while in offshore protection and not being brought back to Australia. Nobody made that case. Labor, the Greens, Karen Phelps, the Independent, they didn't come up with any cases where Australia had failed to deliver the medical care necessary for refugees and asylum seekers. And it was obvious these new laws were going to be gamed. People would use them to move permanently to Australia. And, of course, we worried it might encourage more boats. Now, since then, we know more boats have been intercepted. And we also know now that 179 people have come to Australia under these Medivac laws, and none of them, not one of them, is in hospital. In fact, only a dozen or so ever went to hospital after coming here. Yet, since the government won re-election and announced its intention to repeal the laws, Labor has dug in and stood firm behind them and stood firm, sort of locking in this permanent weakening of border protection. Here's Labor's spokesperson, Kristina Keneally.
That independent health advice panel has upheld the minister's decision to reject someone on health grounds more often than it has overturned it. And that shows that the process is working as it should. When people are sick, they are able to use Medivac to get the care they need. If they are not sick, they don't get to come here for medical treatment.
That was Kristina Keneally back in June. She wouldn't come on and have a chat today, but what she was saying there was simply ridiculous. Why? Because there was never a case made out that anyone was not getting the medical treatment they required, as I said. And as I also mentioned, 179 people have now come and not one of them is being treated in hospital. And as far as we know, none have gone back to Nauru or Manus Island either. Keneally, of course, was a failed state premier. She's been in federal parliament for 5 minutes. She has absolutely no political policy or practical experience in border security issues, and she runs Labor's response. Keneally refuses my requests repeatedly for an interview. She's done that again today, as I mentioned. Also, Karen Phelps, the former independent MP who came up with this harebrained scheme, she refuses to discuss the issue with me either. We learned today that 20 refugees who had won resettlement places in America and were waiting to fly out have come to Australia instead, under the Medivac laws. What a disgrace that is. I've got grave doubts about the motivations and actions of the activists in this field. I worry that these refugees have been talked into this tactic, coming here under the Medivac laws, and it could prevent them going to the US, leave them here in Australia in detention or in limbo. I've seen these activists at work. They tell lies, they play political games, rather than simply try to look after the best interests of the refugees. So imagine that. People who have the promise of a new life in the US, it's got to be the golden ticket, surely, for any asylum seeker. Somehow they've been convinced into ticking the right boxes to come to Australia for medical treatment and therefore remain officially in detention with their futures uncertain. The sooner these Medivac laws are repealed, the better. And the sooner the refugees are permanently resettled somewhere, including in the US, the better. And the sooner Labor stops playing games with this crucial national security issue, the better.